now that I have basic characters, or at least the main ones, out of the way, we're going to be talking about some of the more plot-relevant characters and groups, that being the divine representatives, the deities. I just call them divine representatives. That's basically, it is a terrible name, but that's what I'm working with. Okay, please bear with me, as this is also a very messy video, just as the last one was, all over the place, so I apologize. So as I've said in the last video very vaguely, the divine representatives each embody concepts, and these things can range from life, goodwill, order, justice, and time. So these are just some of the basic divine representatives, or at least the most important ones. There are also lesser gods and lesser concepts that aren't very general or as broad as the bigger ones, and inasmuch they can basically devour other smaller concepts that go under the general umbrella of those. So things that kind of fall under the category or are very similar in idea can be absorbed by other divine representatives. Let's kind of dive into them. So I'm going to order these by their importance in the story, or at least just how often they intervene and intertwine with other characters. So at the top we have Fiarie. Fiarie is the divine representative of life. And though he is very, very prevalent within this story, he's also probably one of the characters who I think books it the most out of every other character. Fiarie created humans because he was obsessed with the concept of change. At the time he found Earth, it was basically lifeless. There was nothing. And he knew what he wanted to create from the beginning, that being a type of creature that could experience change and experience mortality while also having a form of sentience. So he got to work creating humanity, basically. And there were a lot of failed attempts that happened before that, and a bunch of different creatures he created before settling on the outline of humans. But after a while, life on Earth existed because of him. So when he created the first humans, or at least the very first, in the sense that there was none that fit his standard before this, the other divine representatives kind of saw this going on and was like, hey, we want some of these too. So Fiarie kind of tried to make humans that fit their idealistic standards. And of course that didn't work fully. So to compromise, he sort of said, hey, I can make the outlines and the vessels for your humans, but you're going to have to instill them with a bit of your touch and magic in order to get these things to function properly. And so they did. And that's why each of the different nations has separate abilities and different characteristics in comparison to each other. But because they aren't able to function properly as Fiaries do, there are drawbacks to each of these different human species. For example, some of them have an age cap of 35, roughly. Other ones have basically entirely been built upon magic, and without magic, they die. And I think in the more serious cases is Notus's people, the spry folk, have to basically eat other humans to survive. So obviously those different subspecies of humans are a result directly of Fiarie's influence on other divine representatives. He basically created everything with life, and he is constantly creating more life because, as you know, the embodiment of said concept, if he's not creating, then he's doing essentially nothing, and I think he hates that the most. So even when these different deities were having conflicts with each other, and during the times of war, he just kind of booked it and started to create life on other planets and sort of experiment around with that. And a lot of these different experiments were created with the detriment of the species being created, because some of them were very ill-suited for their bodies, some of them created more conflicts with each other in the cases of the two planets that Goob and Struit and Aram are from, because both of those planets were also created in the time that Fiarie fled from Earth to create more stuff. And when those two planets started warring with each other, he booked it back to Earth and then helped solve the conflict going on over there. But in many ways, he kind of creates a lot of the issues for these characters and then runs away from said problems. So, that's just one of... And though he does that, he's probably one of my favorite to draw because he always has this sort of unhinged little face. And I guess in more recent stuff within the narrative, he sort of takes a more evil scientist-looking outfit, though he doesn't really practice science at all. This is purely, like, magic. Whatever. That's Fiarie. Next up is Viria, Justice, and Uiria, which is Vengeance. So, they were technically brother terms, but eventually became bitter with one another. When they were initially meeting humans for the first time, Viria got to make his own variant of humans, but Uiria did not. And this was because of Fiarie's, personal favoritism. He decided to let different concepts and representatives with more favorable traits get to make humans, and because of that, Justice got their own subspecies of humans, while Uiria did not. So Uiria was a little bit bitter about that, and was the main cause of the first war, and led a bunch of different deities along with a bunch of his own humans to kind of create conflict with other people. So he was the main cause of war, and it was during that war when Kellis was originally born and drafted into it. And it was because of Kellis' sacrifice that Uiria was dispelled as a concept. But because they are concepts, they never fully disappear. They more or less converge with other ones. So because of that, Uiria and Viria converged into one creature of sorts. But obviously Viria has more prevalence and more consciousness within the two. So while the two are one joint creature now, neither of them are able to truly get anything done because of the bitterness they feel towards one another, despite being connected. Because of that, it falls into states of disrepair and chaos. So that's kind of why they started to create the vessels in hopes to find one that was suited for taking on their role, which eventually ended up being Saya. And after that, they kind of just separated themselves from the divine representatives as a whole, and is probably chilling doing something unrelated to everything else. In many ways, they are a guardian of Saya, but a very bad one. A very terrible one. Our third is Notus, and Notus is the divine representative of order. And in terms of involvement with their nations, I think Notus takes the cake for that. Notus is basically the divine representative of Nasturtium, and Nasturtium is very closed off. After the first war with Uiria and Viria and the other divine representatives, shortly after that, Notus sort of closed off Nasturtium from basically everyone else. So because of that, they are very closely knitted with each other and also their divine representative because of his constant involvement in their development. Because he is order, he has to kind of be there to instill that within his people. And a lot of the ways that he keeps said order is through force of tradition. And by that, obviously, I mean the eating people thing. So, though a lot of them don't necessarily need to eat humans anymore because of their slow separation from the trait, because they're constantly involving themselves with humans outside of nasturtium, they still fear the idea of not having order because of that instillment he put into them. So while they don't need it, it's so ingrained into their being that they feel like they need to still eat humans, even though they don't necessarily, and that's the case for Aegeus. And they weren't very fond of Aegeus because Aegeus being an outlier like she was, and there were obviously many deserters and variants before her that probably had similar situations. They kind of just isolated her from everyone else because of that fear of breaking tradition. And I guess in terms of the creation of Spryfolk, Notus had the vision to create a creature that exceeded the limits of what a human body could take. And I don't have it drawn out, but it very well exists in my mind. They kind of have a second mouth right under, like, their chin. So their face is one of their, like, actual faces, but there's a second mouth that kind of extends and outreaches outside of that. And they also have, obviously, because they are spider-related, adjacent spider limbs that kind of, like, out of the body. But obviously that exceeds the average mortal constraints. So to sustain their bodies originally, because they used to be a lot more misshapen magically, they had to eat humans directly to survive. And while that isn't the case as they continue to go down generation to generation, and that trait is not necessarily needed anymore, it still is important in the terms of order and tradition being kept perpetually. So that's that. These next two I don't think have as much significance, and I don't think I have most of these drawn out. But our next divine representative of importance is Giasa, and Giasa is the representative of Goodwill. He originally was the representative of elements, but I feel like that wasn't a concept that, like, made much sense in the lineup with everyone else, because there's, like, life, there's order, there's justice, and then there's elements. So as of recently, I've been workshopping to find another alternative that I think fits them more. So right now we have Goodwill. And in terms of nation quality of life, I think Giasa's takes the cake. Magnolia has probably some of the nicest places to live world-wise. Each of the creatures and subhumans that live within Magnolia have this sort of magic within them, and it can be unlocked by kind of doing good in the world and continuing to do said thing. If you, like, abuse that power or continue to act in negative manner, then that power is sort of restricted back to just keeping you alive, essentially. So it's a very reward-based system of magic. And because of that, generally, a lot of the people that come from Magnolia are pretty good people. That's basically all I have for him. Our next one is Laer. And Laer is the representative of time. And in separation from the other divine representatives, they're more like a council of moments, and by that I mean they've separated themselves into different periods of time within the life cycle of a mortal. So that way they can, like, make more decisions and pull from more moments of time. Because a lot of the people that come from Xeranthemum are time-based. So they have very long, extending recollection of things, almost photographical. So because of that, they are mostly historians that live within Xeranthemum. But because of that, they have a very shortened lifespan. Most of them only live to around 30 to 35, though there are some outliers that negatively affects their recollection, so they don't have as strong a memory as other people from that nation do. And I think that's like, I think the only relevant character that I have from Xeranthemum at the moment is Mistal, and I will be talking about him in the next video. So, yeah. Now that we've sort of gotten all of the main divine representatives out of the way, we can talk a little bit about some of the very, very few I have written for sub-gods, sub-deities, and the lesser representatives. So, at the top of this, we have Wonder, and Wonder had a hand in Goob and Struit's creation. So, when Goob and Struit were being created by the species, Wonder sort of implemented a little bit of themselves into Goob and Struit. After the conflict with Viria and Uiria, Wonder separated themselves into two beings, a mortal shell and separate entity. One half of Wonder goes by the name of Skippie, and Skippie is this very rotund creature, and it takes the appearance of a small child, and sort of goes around spreading joy and whimsy. Good for them. And then there's that second half of them that exists separately and has taken a completely abstracted form. So they kind of exist in congruence with each other, and they feel what the other is feeling, but they also feel like that constant dissonance because they are separate. And the half of Wonder that is on Earth currently, Skippie, is also under the watch of Kellis. So Kellis has a lot of people in his house up in there right now, that being Goob, Struit, and Skippie, and also, oftentimes, Mirayah. These next two are some of the vague ones that I think existed sometime in the past but were converged into other more powerful divine representatives, and they absorbed their essence. So Jerin, or Laer, used to be a very small nation that was adjacent to Nasturtium. So Laer was beside Nasturtium, and sometime after the war, and when Notus decided to close off Nasturtium, he also quietly absorbed the essence of Jerin. So those small amount of humans that do live inside of the nation of Laer also are directly tied to Nasturtium. So when they need to take a quick snack, or when spry folk also need to create offspring, they go to Laer. And I don't think I have much to say on Jerin, because, you know, their territory was taken along with their life, and they were absorbed for a purpose to propel Notus's vision further. But yeah, that's just one of many that do end up getting absorbed into other concepts. Second is Mirayah, and Mirayah was a divine representative of vitality. And because vitality and life are similar concepts, and because vitality is a more specific title, it ended up overlapping with life and nearing the end of the war with, Viria and Uiria. Mirayah basically gave up their own sense of being to absorb with Fiarie and converge, so that Fiarie could, assist properly in destroying Uiria. That's basically all I have on Mirayah. And I'm sure that there are other deities that existed, or I will create on later, that were also converged during this time, or were absorbed by other concepts in order to gain more power. But other than that, the two that are technically lesser representatives, but also not really because they were man-made, was Goob, which is Elation, and Struit, which was Mania. And both of them have similar concepts also, but they're distant enough to be separate entities, just like Vengeance and Justice were, because they are kind of similar in that sense. And I think for both of them that's kind of explanatory, so there's not much to say on that. And besides that, I think that's all of the ones that I have currently listed. Of course, I'm sure at some point there might be other ones that exist down the line, or have existed and just kind of dissolved from being. But yeah, that's basically everything on the divine representatives, and everything I think is needed to know moving forward. So yeah, bye!